How's it going, everyone? This is going to be part 2 of the Q-Power brakes. I previously did part 1, which was on the hydraulic system of the braking, and I suggest you go watch that first if you're going to be doing any work on your brakes of your Q-Power scooter. I imagine things are the same on their newer scooters, but this is the original Q-Power, and it would also be for that Q-Power black version that has the dual shocks on the front. These are pretty generic calipers that are used on these things, these red ones here. They're used on the Q-Power black version. This Q-Power, I've seen them on all kinds of other Chinese scooters on the market. Pretty consistent. This is a pretty common caliper and hydraulic system use. So this may apply to other scooters as well, but specifically this is a Q-Power, Kiwa Q-Power scooter. Again, I suggest you watch the part 1 of this series on the brakes, the Q-Power brakes, where I go over all the hydraulics and how to add fluid to your line if you need to, how to adjust things in the hydraulics. This is going to be part 2, and this is going to be dealing more with removing the calipers, removing the brake pads, as if you're going to replace your brake pads and do adjustments from there. Before we get into that, there's 2 things I want to mention off the top. One is the Q-Power. With the 35 amp controllers, I can't speak of the older 40 amp version. Here's what the 35 amp ones look like. It shows right there the amperage, 35 amps, front and back. And they go along with this display here that comes with them as in a kit. You can buy this kit with these 2 controllers, 35 amp controllers, and this display. And I've done another video on how to install that. Anyway, with that particular setup, there is electronic braking setting in the P settings, and I've got those settings written down right here. But basically, the motor braking, as you can see at the bottom there, P09 is the motor braking. There's 3 settings: 0, 1, and 2. 0 means you've turned off the electronic motor braking, so you're only using your brake pads at that point. 1 is kind of a mid-range electronic motor braking, and 2 is the high motor braking. I personally like it at 1. That's enough of the motor braking for me. And basically, if you set it to 2, you're going to get serious motor braking. To me, it's almost too much, so that's why I put mine to 1. But in other words, if you want to save your brake pads, make sure you're not set to 0 for that P09 setting. Otherwise, you're not utilizing the motor braking at all, and you're using only your brake pads. If you want to save your brake pads, set it for 2 or give it a try, see how you like it. So that's the first thing. You have electronic motor braking to supplement your brake pads, and I highly suggest you make use of that, either setting 1 or 2. If that P09 is set for 0 again, you're not making use of it at all, and you're going to strictly be burning 2 brake pads. Okay, just to show you really quick, actually let me show you this whole list here. You can pause or get a closer look at it, but that's basically all the P settings. I've done another video on this, but if you're simply looking for those settings, there they are. And just to show you really quick in my settings, I'm going to go into settings mode by pushing the 2 buttons at the same time. You may notice this is a different display. I'm going to do another video on this really quick. This is, I think I paid $35 shipping this from China, and it takes the place of the Kiwa display that they sell for $100. So you could literally get 3 of these for the price of one of the Kiwa ones, and it works fine. Like I said, I'll do another video on that here shortly, very shortly. So I turn on my display, push 2 buttons at the same time to get into the P settings. There they are. I'm not going to go through all these. I just showed you the list, and if you want to, you can just kind of look at what I have if you want to set it up like mine. I'm not going to go through these now, but what I'm looking for is P09. And there it is. Right now I have it set for 2. I didn't know that. That's set for the strong motor braking. And you can see it kicks you out of that menu really quick. So that's where you'd set that, P09. If you want to change it, of course, you go into settings, make it blink, and you can set it to, like I said, 1 or 0. 0, 1, or 2, 1 being the mid setting. I've been riding this, so I'm going to leave this set at 2 because that's where I've been riding it lately, and it seemed pretty good. So I'm leaving mine at 2 now. If that's too much for you, then go to 1. Okay, next thing, before you even go about trying to take your brake pads out, removing calipers, whatever, you need to make room in the hydraulic lines for fluid, so when you can push the pistons back out from the caliper, just like on a disc brakes on a car. Over time, as the pads where the pistons that push the pads go closer and closer in, when it comes time to change them, you got to push those back out to make room for the new pads. What that does is it pushes fluid, because this is a hydraulic system, it pushes fluid back up the hydraulic line, so you got to have room for that. Sometimes when you do that in a car, you just take the lid off of the fluid reservoir, so you can push the fluid back up into the reservoir. In this case, we're not going to do that, but there is an adjustment. If you look behind your brake levers, and I go over this in the first video about the hydraulics, there's this little screw here, and right behind the handle, there's your brake handle. Both front and back has it. There's a little screw there. 2mm Allen key will fit in there. And basically what that does, I'm going to put that in there so we can see it better. Okay, so you can see I got the Allen wrench in that screw there, so I could adjust it right now. I'm not going to, because my brakes are good, but I just wanted to show you this. That screw, its midpoint is right at the edge of the black curved metal part there. You can see it's pretty much right at the edge. That's its mid-range. It'll screw in a lot more that way. It'll screw out a lot more this way. So that's an adjustment you make later. Again, watch part 1 of the video for that. So anyway, before you want to do anything, because you're going to have to expand those pistons in the caliper when you get to it, in order to get the brake pads out and to get the new ones in. So in order to make the most room for that, most room in the line for more fluid to be pushed back out, if you take this screw and you adjust it completely counterclockwise, so you're unscrewing it, which is going to bring the screw out this way, and you want to unscrew that as far as you can. It'll stop when you get to a point. Don't force it or anything, but you'll know when you get to the end. And just unscrew it as far as you can until it stops. What you're doing, there's basically like a plunger. There's a reservoir built into this handle here that holds the brake fluid. And this kind of pushes, for lack of a better term, a plunger would be pushing in, which would create more pressure in the line because you're minimizing the room in there. Or when you unscrew it, the plunger comes back out this way, which creates more room in the reservoir, which lessens the pressure in the brake line. And that's what you want to do, because you're going to need to expand those, or push the pistons back in the caliper once you get to that point, to get the brake pads out and to get the new ones on. So the first thing you want to do before anything is unscrew this all the way out. Both sides are the same. I'm only going to talk about one side, but they're both the same. So you would do that, unscrew that counterclockwise. It'll come out as far as it can, and then that's the first thing you need to do. From there, we'll be able to remove the caliper off the scooter, and then we'll be able to, because we've lessened the pressure in that line by turning that screw out, we'll be able to press the pistons back in to make room to get the pads out. Okay, so I'm just going to show you on this one what the process is to basically remove those brake pads. Now you can see here's our, this is a front caliper on the scooter. Doesn't really matter, the front and back are the same. And first I'm just going to remove the caliper from the rotor and the wheel by taking out these two screws here. Keep an eye on your hardware. There's 2-piece washer here. It's kind of a cupped washer. There's 2 pieces that fit together there. So take those out, and then of course there's a washer on this side. So keep all your hardware together. Don't lose any of that. Okay, so I've taken the hardware off of the caliper there. Caliper's now loose hanging there. Just to show you this, the hardware, as I mentioned, there's 2 pieces on the inner side there. It's cupped. There's this outer piece here and an inner piece, which you can see is rounded and fits into there. So that's how that goes on there. So basically, screw goes into the caliper with this washer, passes through the caliper. On the other side, you have these this cupped washer set before it then threads into the black piece there. Okay, so looking at the caliper here, there's our 2 brake pads, these 2 tabs sticking out, and there's this little spring piece in the middle that's in there to, I guess, put outward pressure on the pads. So when you release the brake handle, it's kind of like a spring. When you press it in, it's compressing that spring, that little clip there in the middle, and when you release the brake handle, the spring will press back out, allowing the pads to go back in. So that's kind of what that's for. So first thing, we want to remove that spring. Basically, you got to get some pliers or something, pinch it together, and then you should be able to pull it straight out. Okay, so basically I just took my pair of pliers, grabbed a hold of that spring there, and then compressed it, and I could just pull it straight back out. Okay, so I'm going to set that aside with my hardware. Make sure you keep your hardware, your springs, everything somewhere safe, because you're going to need that. You don't want to lose that. Okay, so next let's try to get these brake pads out of here. So what we need to do now is we need to push the pistons back in this way, which will give us more room in that gap to get the pads out. So basically what I'm going to do is flip this around this way so I can see this gap here. I'm going to take a small screwdriver and stick it in between the two pads and then push one way and then the other on the pads inside of there. Try a different screwdriver, a little bit bigger one. What I'm trying to do is just push the pads back inside the caliper a little bit more. Sorry, I know I'm not getting good video here, but it's hard to do. Okay, so I can feel those pistons pushing back in there. I think I might have enough room now. Okay, so it's just a matter of getting enough space to be able to get the pad through this groove here. And again, to do that, you have to, if it's too tight and you can't get the pad out, you need to compress the pistons that are inside this caliper by, again, using a screwdriver of some sort, getting it in between the brake pads, and then prying one way and then the other. You're trying to get the pistons to push back in, which will allow more room in the gap here to get the pads out. Okay, so I got the first one out. Second one should come out pretty easy. Again, I'm just going to grab the tab, manipulate it to get in the middle, and then push it through. Okay, so let's take a look at these here. First of all, here's the bad ones again. You can see how badly grooved they are. In fact, this one on the right, it's actually kind of just deteriorating altogether. And these are in pretty good shape. As you can see, there's no groove to them at all yet. So these are pretty good pads, practically brand new, I would say. Not much mileage on them compared to something like this, where you can see they're grooved badly. And then again, if I were to put these on top of each other like they will be in the caliper, and if they're pressed all the way together, you can see there's not much of a gap there whatsoever in between them. Where if we go back and do the same on these bad ones, you've got that big groove right in the middle that's not enough to pinch on the rotor when it closes. Okay, so we're going to take these pads and we're going to throw them in the other scooter. Inspect your brake line. This is the hydraulic line that's attached to the caliper here. So there's fluid inside the line. There's fluid inside the caliper pushing those pistons. And so the fluid is in this line. Inspect your connections all the way around here. Inspect the caliper. Take a good look at it all over it, especially where it's connected. Follow your hose back. Look at your hose to where it comes back up and connects into the brake handle reservoir right here. And what you're looking for is you don't want to see any kind of oil or any liquid at all along this whole line, because if there's liquid leaking out of this brake line, then you're not going to have any pressure. This whole hydraulic system operates on pressure. If you have a leak, then you have no pressure and it's not going to work. So I've looked this one over and I don't see any signs whatsoever of any fluid leaking out of this thing anywhere. So I believe everything's intact. I just need to put my brake pads in, mount it back up there, see how my pressure is. If I need to, I'll add some more brake fluid. There's an adjustment up here also you can use. This little screw right here on the end of the brake handle. So I'm going to do all that stuff. I'll get to that in a little bit. First step though here is to put the brake pads back into the caliper with that little spring and then mount this caliper back up onto the wheel. Okay, so you can see I got the first pad sitting in there. Now let's look in the slot here on the other side. You can see the pad sticking up there on the bottom. It's sticking higher above the red part. See it there on the edge? So what I'm going to do now I got that pad in there, so I'm going to push that pad down so it drops down below the edge of the red. which will then free up room so I can get the other pad in on the other side. So again, you can see the edge of the pad there sticking up higher than the red part. Okay, so I just took a screwdriver in there. The pad is still in there. So I just took a screwdriver, put it in there on top of the pad, and pushed it down so it dropped down, and it's now even, pretty much even with that red piece there. Now I should have enough room to get the other pad in on the top side. Once I do that, I have to put that little spring clip in, and then they should be held in there. Okay, so I got the new pads in there, and mounted the caliper back onto the bracket. And pads are very loose in there right now. You can see that spring. Basically, that spring is only there to hold the pads in place in an instance like this when there's no pressure on them, because the pads are pretty loose. Okay, so I got that on there. Next step is we need to get pressure into this brake line. And if everything's intact here, if there's no leakage anywhere on our connections or in the hose, then we're just low on brake fluid right now, which is understandable to me. Actually, I had this caliper off and spilled some brake. I actually had the hose disconnected before, so lost a little brake fluid there. So I'm going to need to add some brake fluid to this line, and that's our next step. Try and get enough brake fluid in this line, see if I can get any pressure into this line at all to work on those pistons in the caliper. Okay, so at this point I've got my caliper mounted back on there, my pads in there, the little spring in there, everything tightened down. Again, pay attention to your hardware, the way you put it on. Screw, washer, goes to the caliper, then you have those two cupped washers before it threads into the mounting bracket, the black mounting bracket on the scooter. So I did have to add some fluid on that other scooter. This is mine now. I've jumped back to. And again, for information on adding fluid to your hydraulic line, refer to part 1, Q Power part 1 brakes that I did. That goes over the entire hydraulic thing. Okay, so moving on with this, once you have everything mounted up here again like you had it originally, you need to turn that screw back in up here on the handle to put more pressure back into the line, and hopefully that'll be all you need to do and you won't need to add any more fluid. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the screw midpoint is right even with the edge of the black rounded part there on the handle bracket. Previously, when we started, you unscrewed this all the way out, so now you need to screw it back in. And to determine how far you go will depend on how you like the feel of your handles. Obviously, they shouldn't pull all the way back to the hand grip. So you can see mine kind of stop about that far out. That's about where I like them, and that's where the pads are contacting the rotor. Now, if it went too far in, I could turn the screw further in, which would increase the pressure in the line, which would tighten this up a little bit. However, it's a fine balance, because if you turn this too far in, then your pads are good. The further you turn this in, the closer your pads are going to get together. At some point, you're going to start rubbing on the rotor. And a little bit of rubbing is okay, but you don't want constant rubbing on your rotor. You just go wear down your brake pads. So you need to adjust this screw. Ideally, 100% ideal would be right where I've got mine, right at the edge there, because that's the middle point. And then you have play in both directions if you need to adjust it from there. If you, I mean, absolutely, you could turn this in further. You could turn this in all the way, and if you had enough pressure on here to do the job, that's okay. You just wouldn't have any more, a lot of range to adjust from there. Should you turn this screw all the way in clockwise till it stops, and you don't have enough pressure in here still, like this comes all the way back and hits your handle, then that would mean you would need to go ahead, open up the line up here and add some fluid into the reservoir. And again, part 1 of this video on the Q Power brakes goes over all that process. So again, after you get everything mounted up, adjust the screw to be where you like the feeling of the hand grip here. I mean the lever pulling for the brakes, and where you can spin the tire and not hear a bunch of rubbing going on. Again, a little bit of rubbing is fine. Mostly these rotors on these scooters are not completely straight, so you're going to get a little wobble as they go around or something, where you might hear a little rubbing here and there. The other thing too, up on a stool like this, You may hear a little rubbing or you may not hear any rubbing, but when you put it back on the ground, and the way the scooter and the way the person's on it, it's going to change where those pads are contacting at. So it's kind of hard to do exactly to get it so it's perfectly not rubbing. You just do as good as you can, and you just don't want it rubbing a lot where it's going to wear down your brake pads. So once you have everything mounted back up and you have that screw turned in at least midway, so you have enough pressure in your line to be able to push the cylinders in, the pistons in. You can loosen these up. Actually, maybe just leave them loose when you put them on. Don't tighten them all the way, because you have some play in these. As you can see, this, like on mine here, I have the screw tightened, but you can see there's a gap there. And that's because the mounting holes in the calipers are oval shaped, kind of, which gives you room to maneuver them back and forth. For example, if I loosen these two screws, I could push this caliper in that way or back out this way, and it allows you to basically change the angle of the caliper as it's sitting on the rotor to help adjust for rubbing and to get it centered in the right place. Now, a good starting point for this is have these screws loose enough where you can wiggle the caliper back and forth, and then grab and hold the brake handle so the pads push in on the rotor nice and tight. Now while still holding that tight like that, you've kind of centered the rotor where it should be. So either have somebody do that, or if you can grab one hand and on the brake lever, hold that tight so the pads are up against the rotor, and then tighten these screws down. Don't tighten one down all the way first. Do it back and forth. Get this one so it's snug. Do this one so it's snug, and then back and forth. And while you're still holding that, and then that, once you get it tight, you can let go of the lever, and you should be, that's a good starting point for where you're going to have this thing locked down at. If you need to, you can loosen these again a little bit and eye it out, and basically you just have to manipulate this till it's in the best place possible with no rubbing. Once you have that tightened down, if you get a little rubbing, I'll show you a little bit here at the end of the video how you can get rid of a little bit of rubbing you may have. So there's a couple ways to deal with rubbing. One, loosen these screws. You can manipulate the position of the caliper on there while you're spinning the tire. Have somebody spin the tire, tighten these down. Like I said, if you leave these loose, grab and hold the handle so the pads contact the rotor. Tighten these down, that'll be a good starting point. And then, as well as I mentioned earlier, just adjusting the screw. Turning it clockwise will bring the pads closer together. Turning it counterclockwise will bring the pads further apart. And that's another way you can compensate for any rubbing on the rotor with the brake pads. Okay, so lastly, I wanted to make it so there's as little rubbing as possible between the brake pads and the rotor. And that's almost nearly impossible to do on these scooters, because these rotors are inevitably bent in certain places. If you had a brand new rotor, and maybe, but I don't know if these are even that high quality. But they can have bends on them. And what that'll exhibit is, like, if you can spin your wheel, and I've already kind of fixed this one as best as I can. It doesn't sound like there's a lot of, I can hear a very slight rubbing in one place, but it's not enough to worry about. It's pretty good. But previous to that, when I'd spin it, at one point I'd hear it hit one of the pads. I'd spin it and go like, so just in one spot. What you can do is, if you look down at the rotor along the edge here where it goes into the caliper, and you can see it go in between the two brake pads there. When you spin the wheel, you get a good light like this, and actually it's better if it's lit from the bottom sometimes, where you can see the cracks on the other side of the rotor. You can see the light coming through on each side of the rotor, telling you there's a gap between that and the pad. And spin the rotor, and you'll see, if it's just making noise in a single place, you'll see that at some place or other, the rotor's going to go to the right or to the left a little bit, up against the brake pad. And mine in particular, this one here, it was going out to the outer brake pad every time around. It hit the outer brake pad like that. So what I did is I And I've done this a lot with the other screws, so this works pretty good. I spin the tire to where I find where it's rubbing in, the most at that one spot. And then I know that that's in the brake pads, which are back here. So if I put my finger here, I know like an inch behind it is where it's really rubbing at. So then you can spin the wheel out a little bit. And basically an inch would be like this next one here. And then I'll keep an eye on that, target it like that. And then I just take this rubber mallet, give it a couple light taps in that area, spin it again, trial and error, keep doing a little bit more. And then you can usually straighten it up enough at that one point where you can get to spin without rubbing on it. If it were bent to the inside, then you get some vice grips or something. Actually use these like a needle nose vice grips. Clamp it on wherever that spot is. We'd be bending it to the outside at that point. If you got to go to the inside, just pound it with a rubber mallet. That works really good. If you got to come to the outside, then just grab it and bend it to the outside. Slowly, a little bit at a time. Again, trial and error until you can get as best as you can, and that's all you can do. It's probably, a lot of these, they're going to rub a little bit. You just don't want them constantly dragging on the pads. As you can hear, this one's pretty good now. In fact, I don't really hear anything anymore, so this one's pretty good. Hope this helps some of you guys. Again, it went a lot better than I anticipated from the beginning. I thought I might have to bleed the brakes or something. Turns out that's not the case. You can get plenty of fluid in that reservoir, and yeah, worked out really good. Again, I had the hose completely disconnected at both ends from the caliper, from the reservoir. I dumped fluid out, so I mean, you can't really do hardly any worse than that. And I was able to get it back up and running really good now. Brake handle only comes up to about this point. Pads are fully on the rotor, a lot of pressure, and it's good to go. All right, guys, that's it for this one. Take care.